Today is 2022 St. Christopher's Day, the feast day within the Orthodox Church. Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Section 3, Absolute Mind, Der absolute Geist, Subsection C, Philosophy. Encyclopedia section 572. This science is the unity of art and religion, whereas the vision method of art, external in point of form, is but subjective production and shivers the substantial content into many separate shapes, and whereas religion, with its separation into parts, opens it out in mental picture and mediates what is thus opened out, philosophy not merely keeps them together to make a total, but even unifies them into the simple spiritual vision, and then in that raises them to self conscious thought. Such consciousness is thus the intelligible unity cognized by thought of art and religion, in which the diverse elements in the content are cognized as necessary, and this necessary as free. Encyclopedia section 573. Philosophy thus characterizes itself as a cognition of the necessity in the content of the absolute picture idea, as also of the necessity in the two forms, on one hand, immediate vision and its poetry, and the objective and external revelation presupposed by representation; on the other hand, first the subjective retreat inwards, then the subjective movement of faith and its final identification with the presupposed object. This cognition is thus the recognition of this content and its form. It is the liberation from the one-sidedness of the forms, elevation of them into the absolute form, which determines itself to content, remains identical with it, and is in that cognition of that essential and actual necessity. This movement, which philosophy is, finds itself already accomplished, when at the close it seizes its own notion, in essence, only looks back on its knowledge. Here might seem to be the place to treat in a definite exposition of the reciprocal relations of philosophy and religion. The whole question turns entirely on the difference of the forms of speculative thought from the forms of mental representation and reflecting intellect. But it is the whole cycle of philosophy, and of logic in particular, which has not merely taught and made known this difference, but also criticized it, or rather has let its nature develop and judge itself by these very categories. It is only by an insight into the value of these forms that the true and needful conviction can be gained, that the content of religion and philosophy is the same, leaving out, of course, the further details of external nature and finite mind, which fall outside the range of religion. But religion is the truth for all men. Faith rests on the witness of the Spirit, which, as witnessing, is the Spirit in man. This witness, the underlying essence in all humanity, takes, when driven to expound itself, its first definite form under those acquired habits of thought which his secular consciousness and intellect otherwise employs. In this way, the truth becomes liable to the terms and conditions of finitude in general. This does not prevent the spirit, even in employing sensuous ideas and finite categories of thought, from retaining its content, which, as religion, is essentially speculative, with a tenacity which does violence to them and acts inconsistently towards them. By this inconsistency, it corrects their defects. Nothing easier, therefore, for the rationalist than to point out contradictions in the exposition of the faith, and then to prepare triumphs for its principle of formal identity. If the spirit yields to this finite reflection, which has usurped the title of reason and philosophy, rationalism, it strips religious truth of its infinity and makes it in reality naught. Religion, in that case, is completely in the right in guarding herself against such reason and philosophy and treating them as enemies. But it is another thing when religion sets herself against comprehending reason and against philosophy in general, and specially against a philosophy of which the doctrine is speculative and so religious. Such an opposition proceeds from failure to appreciate the difference indicated and the value of spiritual form in general, and particularly of the logical form, or, to be more precise, still from failure to note the distinction of the content, which may be in both the same from these forms. It is on the ground of form that philosophy has been reproached and accused by the religious party, just as conversely, its speculative content has brought the same charge upon it from a self styled philosophy and from a pithless orthodoxy. It had too little of God in it for the former, too much for the latter. The charge of atheism, which used often to be brought against philosophy, that it has too little of God, has grown rare. The more widespread grows the charge of pantheism, that it has too much of him, so much so that it is treated not so much as an imputation, but as a proved fact, or a sheer fact which needs no proof. Piety, in particular, which with its pious airs of superiority fancies itself free to dispense with proof, goes hand in hand with empty rationalism, which means to be so much opposed to it, though both repose really on the same habit of mind, in the wanton assertion, almost as if it merely mentioned a notorious fact, that philosophy is the all one doctrine or pantheism. It must be said that it was more to the credit of piety and theology when they accused a philosophical system, ergo Spinozism of atheism than of pantheism, though the former imputation at the first glance looks more cruel and insidious. See for reference section 71 note. The imputation of atheism presupposes a definite idea of a full and real God, and arises because the popular idea does not detect in the philosophical notion the peculiar form to which it is attached. Philosophy indeed can recognize its own forms in the categories of religious consciousness, and even its own teaching in the doctrine of religion, which therefore it does not disparage. But the converse is not true. The religious consciousness does not apply the criticism of thought to itself, does not comprehend itself, and is therefore, as it stands, exclusive. To impute pantheism instead of atheism to philosophy is part of the modern habit of mind, of the new piety and new theology. For them, philosophy has too much of God, so much so that if we believe them, it asserts that God is everything and everything is God. This new theology, which makes religion only a subjective feeling and denies the knowledge of the divine nature, thus retains nothing more than a God in general without objective characteristics, without interest of its own for the concrete, fulfilled notion of God. It treats it only as an interest which others once had, and hence treats what belongs to the doctrine of God's concrete nature as something merely historical. The indeterminate God is to be found in all religions, every kind of piety. See section, Encyclopedia section 72. Every kind of piety, that of the Hindu to asses, cows, or to Dalai Lamas, that of the Egyptians to the ox, is always adoration of an object which, with all its absurdities, also contains the generic abstract God in general. If this theory needs no more than such a God, so as to find God in everything called religion, it must at least find such a God recognized even in philosophy, and can no longer accuse it of atheism. The mitigation of the approach of atheism into that of pantheism has its ground, therefore, in the superficial idea to which this mildness has attenuated and emptied God. As that popular idea clings to its abstract universality, from which all definite quality is excluded, all such definiteness is only the non divine, the secularity of things, thus left standing in fixed, undisturbed substantiality. On such a presupposition, even after philosophy has maintained God's absolute universality and the consequent untruth of the being of external things, the hearer clings as he did before to his belief that secular things still keep their being, and form all that is definite in the divine universality. He thus changes that universality into what he calls the pantheistic. Everything is, empirical things without distinction, whether higher or lower in the scale, are. All possess substantiality, and so thus he understands philosophy. Each and every secular thing is God. It is only his own stupidity and the falsifications due to such misconception which generate the imagination and the allegation of such pantheism. But if those who give out that a certain philosophy is pantheism are unable and unwilling to see this, for it is just to see the notion that they refuse, they should before everything have verified the alleged fact that any one philosopher or any one man had really ascribed substantial or objective and inherent reality to all things and regarded them as God. That such an idea had ever come into the hand of anybody but themselves. This allegation I will further elucidate in this exotic discussion. And the only way to do so is to set down the evidence. If we want to take so called pantheism in its most poetical, most sublime, or if you will, its grossest shape, we must, as is well known, consult the Oriental poets, and the most copious delineations of it are found in Hindu literature. Amongst the abundant resources open to our disposal on this topic, I select as the most authentic statement accessible the Bhagavad Gita, or the Bhagavad Gita, and among its effusions, prolix and reiterative ad nauseum, some of the most telling passages. In the 10th lesson, in Schlegel, page 170, in the 10th lesson, in Schlegel, page 162, Krishna says of himself, the citation given by Hegel for Schlegel's translation is here replaced by the version in one or 2 points different in the Sacred Books of the East, volume 8. I am the Self, seated in the hearts of all beings. I am the beginning and the middle and the end also of all beings. I am the beaming sun amongst the shining ones, and the moon among the lunar mansions. Amongst the Vedas, I am Samaveda. I am mind amongst the senses. I am consciousness in living beings. I am Samkara, Siva, among the Rudras, Meru among the high-topped mountains, the Himalaya among the firmly fixed mountains. Among beasts, I am the Lord of beasts. Among letters, I am the letter A. I am the spring among the seasons. I am also that which is the seed of all things. There is nothing movable or immovable which can exist without me. Even in these totally sensuous delineations, Krishna, and we must not suppose there is, besides Krishna, still God, or a God besides, as he said before he was Siva, or Shiva, or Indra, so it is afterwards said that Brahma too is in him, makes himself out to be not everything, but only the most excellent of everything. Everywhere there is a distinction drawn between external, unessential existences and one essential amongst them, which is He. Everywhere there is a distinction drawn between external, unessential existences and one essential amongst them, which He is. Even when, at the beginning of the passage, he is said to be the beginning, middle, and end of living things, this totality is distinguished from the living things themselves as single existences. Even such a picture, which extends deity far and wide in its existence, cannot be called pantheism. We must rather say that in the infinitely multiple empirical world, everything is reduced to a limited number of essential existences, to a polytheism. But even what has been quoted shows that these very substantialities of the external, existent, do not retain the independence entitling them to be named gods. Even Siva or Shiva, Indra, and those similarly situated, melt into the one Krishna. This reduction is more expressly made in the following scene, seventh lesson, page 7 and sequence. Krishna says, I am the producer and the destroyer of the whole universe. There is nothing else higher than myself. All this is woven upon me, like numbers of pearls upon a thread. I am the taste in water. I am the light of the sun and the moon. I am um, I am Om in all the Vedas. I am life in all beings. I am the discernment of the discerning ones. I am also the strength of the strong. Then he adds, the whole universe deluded by these three states of mind developed from the qualities goodness, passion, darkness, does not know me, who am beyond them and inexhaustible. For this delusion of mine, even the Maya is his, nothing independent. Developed from the qualities is divine and difficult to transcend. Those crossed beyond this delusion who resort to me alone. Then the picture gathers itself up in a simple expression. At the end of many lives, the man possessed of knowledge approaches me, believing that Vasudeva is everything. Such a high souled mind is very hard to find. Those who are deprived of knowledge by various desires approach other divinities. Whichever form of deity one worships with faith, from it he obtains the beneficial things he desires, really given by me. But the fruit thus obtained by those of little judgment is perishable. The undiscerning ones, not knowing my transcendent and inexhaustible essence, than which there is nothing higher, think me, who am unperceived, to have become perceptible. This all, which Krishna calls himself, is not any more than the Eleatic one and the Spinozan substance, the everything. This everything, rather, the infinitely manifold, sensuous manifold of the finite, is in all these pictures but defined as the accidental, without essential being of its very own, but having its truth in the substance, the one which, as different from that accidental, is alone the divine and God. Hinduism, however, has the higher concept of Brahma, the pure unity of thought in itself, where the empirical everything of the world, as also those proximate substantialities called gods, vanish. On that account, Colebrooke and many others have described the Hindu religion as at bottom a monotheism. That this description is not incorrect is clear from these short citations. But so little concrete is this divine unity. Spiritual as its idea of God is, so powerless its grip. so to speak, that Hinduism, with a monstrous inconsistency, is also the maddest of polytheisms. But the idolatry of the wretched Hindu, when he adores the ape or other creature, is still a long way from the wretched fancy of a pantheism to which everything is God, and God everything. Hindu monotheism, moreover, is itself an example how little comes of mere monotheism, if the idea of God is not deeply determinate in itself. For that unity, if it be intrinsically abstract and therefore empty, tends to for that unity, if it be intrinsically abstract and therefore empty, tends of itself to let whatever is concrete outside it, be it as a lot of gods or as secular empirical individuals, keep its independence. That pantheism, indeed, on the shallow conception of it, might, with a show of logic, as well be called a monotheism. For if God, as it says, is identical with the world, then as there is only one world, there would be in that pantheism only one God. Perhaps the empty numerical unity must be predicated on the world, but such abstract prediction perhaps the empty numerical unity must be predicated on the world, but such abstract predication of it has no further special interest. On the contrary, a mere numerical unity just means that its content is an infinite multeity and variety of finitudes. But it is that delusion with the empty unity which alone makes possible and induces the wrong idea of pantheism. It is only the picture floating in the indefinite blue of the world as one thing, the all, that could ever be considered capable of combining with God. Only on that assumption could philosophy be supposed to teach that God is the world. For if the world were taken as it is, as everything, as the endless lot of empirical existence, then it would hardly have been even held possible to suppose a pantheism which asserted of such stuff that it is God. But to go back again to the question of fact, if we want to see the consciousness of the one, not as the Hindus split between the featureless unity of abstract thought, on one hand, or on the other, the long winded, weary story of its particular detail, but in its finest purity and sublimity, we must consult the Mohammedans. If, ergo, in the excellent Jalaluddin Rumi, in particular, we find the unity of the soul with the one set forth, and the unity described as love, this spiritual unity is an exaltation above the finite and vulgar, a transfiguration of the natural and the spiritual, in which the externalism and transitoriness of immediate nature and empirical circular spirit is discarded and absorbed. A long note before the end, 174. As one ray of thy light appears the noonday sun, but yet thy light and mine eternally are one, as dust beneath thy feet, the heaven that rolls on high, yet only one, and one forever, thou and I. The dust must turn to heaven, and heaven to dust decay. Yet art thou one with me, and shalt be one for aye. 15. Or yet art thou one with me, and shalt be one for aye. XV. Life shrinks from death in woe and fear, though death ends well life's bitter need. So shrinks the heart when love draws near, as though 'twere death in very deed. For wheresoever love finds room, there self the sullen tyrant dies. So let him perish in the gloom, thou to the dawn of freedom rise. In this poetry, which soars over all that is external and sensuous, who would recognize the prosaic ideas current about so called pantheism, ideas which let the divine sink to the external and the sensuous? The copious extracts which Tholuck, in his work Anthology from the Eastern Mystics, gives us from the poems of Jalaluddin and others, are made from the very point of view now under discussion. In his introduction, Herr Tholuck proves how profoundly his soul has caught the note of mysticism, and there too he points out the characteristic traits of its Oriental phase, in distinction from that of the West and Christendom. With all their divergence, however, they have in common the mystical character. The conjunction of mysticism with so called pantheism, as he says, page 53, implies that inward quickening of soul and spirit which inevitably tends to annihilate that external everything which pantheism is usually held to adore. But beyond that, Herr Tholuck leaves matters standing at the usual indistinct conception of pantheism. A profounder discussion of it would have had for the author's emotional Christianity no direct interest, but we see that personally he is carried away by remarkable enthusiasm for a mysticism which, in the ordinary phase, entirely deserves the epithet pantheistic, where, however, he tries philosophizing. Page 12. He does not go beyond the standpoint of the rationalist metaphysic with its uncritical categories. In order to give a clearer impression of it, I cannot refrain from quoting a few passages which may at the same time give some indication of the marvelous skills of Ruckert, for whom they are taken as a translator. For Ruckert's verses, a version is here substituted, in which I have been kindly helped by Miss May Kindle. 3. I saw but one through all heaven's starry spaces gleaming. I saw but one in all sea billows wildly streaming. I looked into the heart, a waste of worlds, a sea. I saw a thousand dreams, yet one amid all dreaming. And earth, air, water, fire, when they decree, and earth, air, water, fire, when thy decree is given, are molten into one. Against thee none hath striven. There is no living heart but beats unfailingly in the one song of praise to thee from heaven and earth. V. End of note. I refrain from accumulating further examples of the religious and poetic conceptions which it is customary to call pantheistic. of the philosophies to which that name is given, the Eleatic or Spinozist, it has been remarked earlier, see Encyclopedia section 50 in the note, that so far are they from identifying God with the world and making him finite, that in these systems this everything has no truth, and that we should rather call them monotheistic, or in relation to the popular idea of the world, acosmical or acosmical. They are most accurately called systems which apprehend the absolute only as substance. Of the Oriental, especially the Mohammedan, modes of envisaging God, we may rather say that they represent the absolute as the utterly universal genus, which dwells in the species or existences, but dwells so potently that these existences have no actual reality. The fault of all these modes of thought and systems is that they stop short of defining substance as subject and as mind. These systems and modes of pictorial conception originate from the one need common to all philosophies and all religions of getting an idea of God, and secondly, of the relationship of God and the world. In philosophy, it is especially made out that the determination of God's nature determines his relation with the world. The reflective understanding begins by rejecting all systems and modes of conception, which rather the reflective understanding begins by rejecting all systems and modes of conception, which what, whether they spring from heart, imagination, or speculation, express the interconnection of God and the world. And in order to have God pure in faith or consciousness, he is an essence parted from appearance and infinite from the finite. But after this partition, the conviction arises also that the appearance has a relation to the essence, the finite to the infinite, and so on. And thus arises the question of reflection as to the nature of this relation. It is in the reflective form that the whole difficulty of the affair lies. And that causes this relation to be called incomprehensible by the agnostic. It is in the reflective form that the whole difficulty of the affair lies, and that causes this relation to be called incomprehensible by the agnostic. The close, the close of philosophy is not the place. Even in a general exoteric discussion, to waste a word on what a notion means. But as the view taken of this relation is closely connected with the view taken of philosophy generally, and with all imputations against it, we may still add the remark that though philosophy certainly has to do with unity in general, it is not, however, with abstract unity, mere identity, and the empty absolute, but with concrete unity, the notion. But with concrete unity, the notion, and that in its whole course it has to do with nothing else, that each step in its advance is a peculiar term or phase of this concrete unity, and that the deepest and last expression of unity is the unity of absolute mind itself. Would-be judges and critics of philosophy might be recommended to familiarize themselves with these phases of unity and to take the trouble to get acquainted with them. At least to know so much that of these terms there are a great many, and that amongst them there is a great variety. But they show so little acquaintance with them, and still less take trouble about it, that when they hear of unity and relation ipso facto implies unity, they rather stick fast at quite abstract indeterminate unity and lose sight of the chief point of interest, the special mode in which the unity is qualified. Hence, all they can say about philosophy is that dry identity is its principal end result, and that it is the system of identity. Sticking fast to the undigested thought of identity, they have laid hands on not the concrete unity, the notion of content of philosophy, but rather its reverse. In philosophical field, in the philosophical field, they proceed as in the physical field, the physicists, who also is well aware that he has before him a variety of sensuous properties and matters, of usually matters alone, for the properties get transformed into matters also for the physicists, and that these matters, elements, also stand in relation to one another. But the question is, of what kind is this relation? Every peculiarity of the whole difference of natural things, inorganic and living, depends solely on the different modes of this unity. But instead of ascertaining these different modes, the ordinary physicist, chemist included, takes up only one, the most external and the worst, viewed as a composition, applies only it in the whole range of natural structures, which he thus renders forever inexplicable. The aforesaid shallow pantheism is an equally obvious inference from this shallow identity. All that those who employ this invention of their own to accuse philosophy gather from the study of God's relation to the world is that the one, but only the one factor of this category of relation, and that the factor of indeterminateness is identity. Thereupon they stick fast in this half perception and assert, falsely as a fact, that philosophy teaches the identity of God and the world. And as in their judgment, either of the two, the world as much as God, has the same solid substantiality as the other, they infer that in the philosophic idea, God is composed of God and the world. Such then is the idea they form of pantheism, and which they ascribe to philosophy. Unaccustomed in their own thinking and apprehending of thoughts to go beyond such categories, they import them into philosophy, where they are utterly unknown. They thus infected with the disease against which they subsequently raise an outcry. If any difficulty emerge in comprehending God's relation to the world, they at once and very easily escape it by admitting that this relation contains for them an inexplicable contradiction, and that hence they must stop at the vague conception of such relation, perhaps under the more familiar names of, ergo, omnipresence, providence, and such. Faith in their use of the term means no more than a refusal to define the conception or to enter on a closer discussion of the problem. That men and classes of untrained intellect are satisfied with such indefiniteness is what one expects. But when a trained intellect and an interest for reflective study is satisfied, in matters admitted to be of superior, if not even of supreme interest, with indefinite ideas, it is hard to decide whether the thinker is really in earnest with the subject. But if those who cling to this crude rationalism were in earnest, ergo, with God's omnipresence, so far as to realize their faith thereon is a definite mental idea, in what difficulties would they be involved by their belief in the true reality of the things of sense? They would hardly like, as Epicurus does, to let God dwell in the interspaces of things, in essence, in the pores of the physicists. Said pores being the negative, something supposed to exist beside the material reality. This very beside would give their pantheism its spatiality, their everything conceived as the mutual exclusion of parts in space, but in ascribing to God, in his relation to the world, an action on and in the space thus filled, on the world and in it, they would endlessly split up the divine actuality into infinite materiality. They would thus have the misconception they call pantheism or all one doctrine, only as the necessary sequel of their misconceptions of God and the world. But to put that sort of thing, this stale gossip of oneness or identity, on the shoulders of philosophy, shows such recklessness about justice and truth that it can only be explained through the difficulty of getting into the head thoughts of notions. In essence, not abstract unity, but the many shaped modes specified. If statements as to facts are put forward, and the facts in question are thoughts and notions, it is indispensable to get hold of their meaning. But even the fulfillment of this requirement has been rendered superfluous, now that it has long been a foregone conclusion that philosophy is pantheism, a system of identity, an all one doctrine, and that the person, therefore, who might be unaware of this fact is treated either as merely unaware of a matter of common notoriety or as prevaricating for a purpose. On account of this course of assertions, then I have believe myself obliged to speak at more length and exoterically on the outward and inward untruth of this alleged fact. For exoteric discussion is the only method available in dealing with the external apprehension of notions as mere facts, but which notions are perverted into their opposite. On account of this chorus of assertions, then, I have believed myself obliged to speak at more length and exoterically on the outward and inward untruth of this alleged fact. For exoteric discussion is the only method available in dealing with the external apprehension of notions as mere facts, by which notions are perverted into their opposite. The esoteric study of God and identity, as of cognitions and notions, is philosophy itself. Encyclopedia section 574. This notion of philosophy is the self thinking idea, the truth aware of itself. See Encyclopedia section 236. The logical system, but with the signification that it is universality approved and certified in concrete content as in its actuality. In this way, the science has gone back to its beginning. Its result is the logical system, but as a spiritual principle, out of the presupposing judgment, in which the notion was only implicit and the beginning and immediate, and thus out of the appearance which it had there, it has risen into its pure principle, and thus also into its proper medium. Encyclopedia section 575. It is this appearing which originally gives the motive of the further development. The first appearance is formed by the syllogism which is based on the logical system as starting point, with nature for the middle term, which couples the mind with it. The logical principle turns to nature and nature to mind. Nature, standing between the mind and its essence, sunders itself, not indeed to extremes of finite abstraction, nor itself to something away from them and independent, which, as other than they, only serves as a link between them. For the syllogism is the idea, and nature is essentially defined as a transition point and negative factor, and as implicitly the idea. Still, the mediation of the notion has the external form of transition, and the science of nature presents itself as the course of necessity, so that it is only in the one extreme that the liberty of the notion is explicit as a self amalgamation. Encyclopedia section 576. In the second syllogism, this appearance is so far superseded that that syllogism is the standpoint of the mind itself, which, as the mediating agent in the process, presupposes nature and couples it with the logical principle. It is the syllogism where mind reflects on itself in the idea. Philosophy appears as a subjective cognition of which liberty is the aim, and which is itself the way to produce it. Encyclopedia section 577, the final section. The third syllogism is the idea of philosophy, which has self knowing reason, the absolutely universal, for its middle term, a middle which divides itself into mind and nature, making the former its presupposition as process of the idea's subjective activity, and the latter its universal extreme as processing of the objectively and implicitly existing idea. The self judging of the idea into its two appearances, Encyclopedia sections 575 and 576, characterizes both as its, the self knowing reasons, manifestations, and in it there is a unification of the two aspects. It is the nature of the fact, the notion which causes the movement and development, yet this same movement is equally the action of cognition. The eternal idea, in full fruition of its essence, eternally sets itself to work, engenders and enjoys itself as absolute mind. And we end with the final quotation, originally in Greek. From Aristotle's Metaphysics, 12, 7, 107, 1072b, translated by W.D. Ross in Barnes' edition, The Complete Works of Aristotle, Revised Oxford Translation, Princeton University Press, 1984. And thought in itself deals with that which is best in itself, and that which is thought in the fullest sense with that which is best in the fullest sense. And thought thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming into contact with and thinking its objects, so that thought and object of thought are the same. For that which is capable of receiving the object of thought, in essence, the substance is thought. And it is active when it possesses this object. Therefore, the latter, rather than the former, is the divine element which thought seems to contain. and the act of contemplation is what is most pleasant and best. If, then, God is always in that good state in which we sometimes are, this compels our wonder. And if in a better, this compels it yet more. And God is in a better state. And life also belongs to God, for the actuality of thought is life. And God is that actuality. And God's essential actuality is life, most good and eternal. We say, therefore, that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration, continuous and eternal, belong to God, for this is God.